When our brains don't have all the information in a situation, our imagination has a tendency to fill in the blanks with a variety of stories and outcomes. For most of us, these stories tend to be fictional and false, not grounded in reality. This can lead to anxiety, isolation, and problems in relationships. Do you find yourself filling in the blanks when you don't have all the answers in a situation? Do these stories cause you anxiety or problems in your relationships?
My daughter is out on a date with her new boyfriend, and she's an hour past her curfew. She's not answering texts or calls. Is she okay? What if she got in a car accident? Is she drinking? What if she gets pregnant?
It's 3 p.m. on Friday, and my boss sends me an email letting me know that she needs to meet with me the first thing Monday morning. Am I getting a raise or a promotion? But my sales have been down this past year. Maybe I'm getting fired.
I sent a text to one of my closest friends about getting together for lunch. It's been 2 days and no response. She usually answers texts within an hour of me reaching out. Did she get the text? Is she okay? Maybe she's mad at me. Did I do something to upset her?
That's a little promotional video for a book by Scott Gornto that is titled The Stories We Tell Ourselves, which is much like the title of this current series of messages that we're in. I'm going to read you a very short excerpt from this book where he says this: "From imagined catastrophes to play-by-play interpretations of other people's behavior, we are expert storytellers, quick to fill in the blanks. But unfortunately, all too often, our behavior is determined by baseless suspicions which trigger needless pain. Real life passes us by as we fall for powerful fantasies of our own creation." The ways that we respond to the people we come in contact with or the circumstances that come our way, they're deeply affected by the stories that we tell ourselves, whether they're true or not, and for better or for worse. I want to give you a quick example out of my own life that I've shared here before. If you've attended Old Town, you're like, Rudy, this story again, but it suits this. I nearly destroyed my relationship with Charlene, my bride, who was sitting here in the front row when we were just dating, because of a twisted story that I had come to believe about myself. She was a really good girl, still is a really good girl. But at that time, I'd really never met a young lady like this. She had this incredible relationship with the Lord where she would actually choose to go to a Bible study instead of go out with me. And wow, she was really walking the talk, and her faith was a priority, and she let me know that. I thought that was very attractive, and again, it was very different because that is not where I was in my faith journey. And not only that, she had her act together. She actually had a savings account with money in it. Wow. Well, I had just had a car repossessed because I wasn't keeping the payments on it. That's how I was rolling at that time. And so looking at Charlene and this girl that she was, and then me knowing who I was, I felt like she deserved a man who was way better than me. And that's because the story that I was telling myself and that I had really come to believe in my heart was that I was unworthy of her love. And looking back on it, it seems dumb to me now, but I had actually convinced myself that all the dumb mistakes that I had made, these really poor choices that hurt me and hurt others, I really had come to believe that I was worth far less than Charlene's estimation of me. And so I told her that things between us weren't going to probably work and that we needed to call the whole thing off for her own protection. I felt like, do you get wrapped up in a guy like me? I'm telling you, I will wreck you. Well, we just celebrated 19 years together a couple of weeks ago. So something changed. Yeah, thank you, Jesus. And thank you, Charlene. So something changed. What was it? Well, God really used my wife to help me rewrite this pathetic story that I was telling myself. And in the face of all of my self-hatred and shame that I experienced, my wife, mostly without, I think, knowing it, forced me to consider the truthfulness of these beliefs that we're actually shaping my identity in a very, very destructive and negative way, which happens when we tell ourselves dumb stories. Listen to this. This is, again, from the stories we tell ourselves. Much of our reality is created with our thoughts, with our feelings, and beliefs. The power behind our thoughts, those stories that we tell ourselves, is immense. And this is important. What you think often becomes you. Now, I like that because that's actually a biblical truth taught in Proverbs chapter 23, verse 7, where it says, as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. So what you think often becomes you. And the assumptions that you make about the narrative of your life can make or break you. Now, in my case, the thing that it almost broke was this relationship with Charlene, but really there was so much more at stake with that narrative. The stories that we tell ourselves, again, whether they're true or false, actually have the power to shape our identity as well as our behavior. And I've often wondered how different my life would be if I would have followed through with that decision to walk away from Charlene and the unconditional love that she was extending toward me. And I shudder when I think about it because I really believe that I would have kept operating out of that faulty view of myself and would have continued on a very lonely and self-destructive path. Because again, what you think often becomes you. I believed that I was unlovable, and so that became me. My behavior began to align with that negative view that I had of myself, and I really hurt her as a result, which is really ironic because the story that I was telling myself I thought was really intended to protect her. I'm trying to protect you. You're going to get burned and hurt by me was the story. I think I was trying to protect her and me from myself. It's really ironic because these stories, as much as we think they're going to protect us, actually do more harm than good. This is Brené Brown. She kind of talks about this a little bit, about how our stories are intended to protect ourselves, when they're often not. She says, our brain, which is wired to protect us above all else, wants a story. It understands story and narrative pattern, and it says, give me a story so that I can understand how to protect you. So my self-hatred was, in a twisted way, a form of self-protection. Now, just a really quick example to drive home this point. Think of anger. Think of that one person, maybe more than one person, who is always seething, always angry. A short fuse, just the slightest provocation will set them off. You think of that person. Well, more than likely, they're using that anger as a way to protect themselves. I read about this in this article here. Sometimes, this guy says, sometimes anger is a necessary part of life. But for many people, anger is an emotional pattern that they use to protect themselves from feeling vulnerable. Folks like this who you're imagining in your mind right now, they've convinced themselves that if they don't demonstrate this anger, that they will be putting themselves in a position of getting hurt. Other people might think that they can walk all over them, and so they act tough. They feel like they need to put on this hard exterior because it makes them feel safe. And so it is with many of our other behaviors and emotions that they're shaped and formed by the stories that we create to protect ourselves. And over time, they actually become a part of who we are. They actually serve as a security blanket. And because of that, it can be a very, very difficult thing to rewrite those stories. Even when we're given very clear evidence that we're operating out of a faulty view of ourselves or a completely wrong storyline. What happens when you're confronted? We get defensive. We start trying to convince ourselves that the person doesn't know what they're talking about, or they don't really know who we are. We start making up excuses. We do almost anything to avoid putting ourselves in the vulnerable position of letting go of those stories, because the behaviors and the emotions or physical things that are attached to those stories, they make us feel secure. To change the story, in many cases, is to rip away that security blanket. And that makes people very uncomfortable, and that is why a lot of people don't change. Now, I've gone to great lengths to try to convey that point, and I do have a point in all of that. See, I've said this before, but change is a fundamental, significant part of what it means to be a Christ follower. We come to faith in Jesus Christ, and we become a new creation. The old is gone, the new has come, and then we begin this journey of becoming more and more like Christ and less of what we once used to be. And this process happens over the course of a lifetime as we renew our mind to who God is and who he says we are. And as that happens, our values and our morals, our beliefs, our behaviors, they begin to align with the heart of God. And all of those things that we used to look to for a sense of value and purpose and security, our identity, those things, they begin to lose their power over us, or at least they should. But that doesn't always happen because change doesn't happen automatically. It requires a choice on our part. And so I want to read you a very, very quick story about someone who sensed that something was missing from his life. He was experiencing, as you'll see in the story, a sense of insecurity. And so he comes to Jesus looking for some answers. But he doesn't like the answer that he gets from Jesus. He realized that what he's looking for is going to require drastic change on his part. And so he walks away. It's the story of the rich young ruler. You all, I'm sure, are very familiar with the story. But it's in Mark chapter 10. It's also in Luke 18, another version of it. But I'm going to read the story, and then I'm going to share a couple of observations that I think we should consider. So it's in Mark chapter 10, verses 17 through 22, but it'll be up here on the screen for you. And so here's the story. It says, as Jesus started on his way, a man came running up to him. Kneeling down in front of him, he cried out, "Good teacher, what one thing am I required to do to gain eternal life?" Jesus said, "Well, you already know the commandments. Don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't give false testimony, don't cheat, and honor your father and mother." And well, the man said to Jesus, "Well, teacher, I've carefully observed these laws since my youth." Jesus, after hearing that, fixed his gaze upon this man with tender love and said to him, "Yet there is still one thing you lack. Go sell all that you have and give the money to the poor, and then all of your treasure will be in heaven. After you've done this, come back and walk with me." Completely shocked by Jesus' answer, he turned and he walked away, very sad, for he was one who owned much property. So it's a pretty sad ending to that story. And if you just read that quickly, just a cursory look at this story, it may seem that Jesus is really being tough on this young man and that he's being very unreasonable, asking him to sell everything that he has and give it to the poor. But that's not entirely the case here. Now, we don't have any details about this young man's life, who he actually was, what was he a ruler of, or any of that. All we know is that he was young, he was rich, and he had some degree of power and influence. But as I was reading this story, and I read it multiple times, both in this book here as well as in the book of Luke, when I was reading it, you can really tell that Jesus' heart went out to this guy. He really loved this guy. So for example, when the young man says that he'd carefully obeyed all of the commandments since he was little, that's a pretty bold claim. But Jesus didn't treat him like the religious leaders who made similar claims. I mean, in their case, he called them hypocrites. He called them whitewashed tombs. But when this rich young ruler says that, Jesus treats him with love and kindness. Again, look at the way Jesus responds to this young man. Jesus fixed his gaze upon him with tender love. So, I don't know, maybe it was the way that Jesus approached him. He runs to Jesus, falls down at his feet, kneeling, and then he cries out to him for help, essentially. Doing that was an act of humility and respect. So I don't know if that's what Jesus saw in this guy, was humility that wasn't in the religious leaders. Whatever the case, Jesus was responding to this rich young ruler with love and compassion and deep concern for what was troubling him. And so even when Jesus was telling this young man that he had to sell all that he had, we have to look at that knowing that Jesus was looking at this man with tender love. See, I don't believe that Jesus was trying to use this moment as an opportunity to raise funds for the poor folks in their community. He was trying to help this rich young ruler recognize that he was trying to find his sense of identity and security and life even in his possessions, and that it wasn't working for him. In spite of all of his power, in spite of his riches and his piety, this young man obviously lacked a genuine sense of security. You can tell by the desperate way that he approached Jesus that he knew he was missing something significant in his life, and Jesus knew exactly what it was. This man had based his security and his hope and his identity in his wealth. Maybe from an outward perspective, it looked like he had it all, but Jesus said, there's still one thing that you lack. Go sell all you have and give your money to the poor, and then your treasure will be in heaven. You can come and follow me. In order to gain this thing that Jesus says he lacked, he'd have to let go of the very thing that gave him the only sense of security that he'd known up to this point, which was his wealth. And in this short moment, and we don't know how short it was, between when Jesus made this bold statement and the time when this young man turns and walks away, in that duration, he started telling himself a story. Now, you have to use your imagination because it's not written in the scriptures, but what would you have thought if you were in this young man's shoes? Can you imagine the story that he must have been telling himself? See, when I read this story, and as I pictured the scene in my mind, what I imagined was that Jesus said, sell everything, give it to the poor, so on and so on. And then this young man looked at Jesus, and then he looked at these 12 men who had obviously given everything to follow Jesus. He looked at them and said, man, they look and smell like they've been wearing those same clothes for days, which they might have. They've been traveling around. He says, he looks at them and he thinks, gosh, they look exhausted. And I even think I see some degree of fear in their eyes. And now this Jesus is telling me to sell all that I have to come and follow him? Look at these guys. What if Jesus isn't who he says he is? Or what will people think if I sell all that I have? He turns out not to be who he says he is, and now I'm no longer the rich young ruler. I'm the broke young beggar. What will people think? See, again, we don't know exactly what was going through his mind, but what we can be sure of is that whatever he was thinking, the conclusion that he came to in the end was that his riches, his earthly possessions, his power and influence that went along with that, were far more valuable than Jesus and the treasure that he said this young man would receive by obeying this call to follow him. And so he turns and he walks away very sad because he owned much property. I think that the story that the rich young ruler was telling himself was that money makes the man. To lose his wealth, to have his wealth stripped away from him, was to lose who he was. And that story actually kept him from following Jesus and experiencing the life that he was offering him. And I think we can learn a lot from that, but not just with regard to money. I think this is a great lesson about the danger of putting too much value on wealth. But this isn't just about our possessions. So what this message is about, and I'm winding it down here. What this message is about is how all of us have some behavior, some emotion, some physical, tangible thing that we are clinging to as a security blanket. And that thing, quite often, is directly related to the story that we're telling ourselves. You know, we live in this culture where we receive an overwhelming amount of messages telling us to define ourselves by external measures. And sometimes we give in to the pressure to define ourselves through our jobs or through our hobbies or through our bank account, through our success, by our grades, by our appearance, by what other people think about us, and for all sorts of other reasons. But there's a significant danger in doing that. This is a psychologist by the name of David Brenner. He wrote a book here called The Gift of Being Yourself. He says this, okay, so then what happens to our identity when we experience failure or lose someone's favor or become burnt out in our job or in our place of service? The very foundation of our identity is shaken and altered, resulting in us hustling to define ourselves by something or someone else. A stable sense of self cannot fully exist when we place our identity in external things. When circumstances change, then our identity constantly changes too, which is getting to the whole point of what I'm talking about this morning. The danger in allowing the stories that we tell ourselves and the associated behaviors as we continue to operate out of those unchecked is that they'll never really provide us with the security that we think they will. You know, like the rich young ruler, we'll always have a sense that we're missing something. And even worse, we can really move into a place of idolatry, which is really what we're getting at. This young man, money had become an idol that was getting in the way of him and Jesus. So for him, it was riches, but for you and me, it might be something else. Imagine if Jesus came up to you right now and he tells you to give up that one thing that gives you security, and that it has really become one of the ways that people have come to know you and define who you are. Imagine what that is. I use this example as last service, but it could really be anything. But just imagine for you fellas or ladies, because there's ladies in this place who actually like to hunt and gather too. If you were told right at the beginning of hunting season, and Jesus said, I love you. He looks at you with compassion, but he recognizes that the degree to which you are engaged in that thing that's not bad in itself, but the degree that you are putting that before all things, he's saying, oh, I love you. I want you to sell all your gear, all of it. What do you mean, all of it? Yeah, all of it. I need you to stop doing that. I know it's about to be hunting season, but let it go and then come and follow me. And then you're going to be standing there in your camo, and the story you're telling yourself, you start going, but that's everything to me. I mean, think of the identity that can be wrapped up in that. You want me to sell all my stuff? Now think about that, because it's the same thing. We have to put ourselves in this kid's shoes, this young man's shoes, because that's really the heart of the matter. Whether it's hunting or football, magic, or whatever. Yeah, I happen to have them in my pocket. Whatever thing that consumes you, that your identity is wrapped in that. And then Jesus says, I want you to give it up and sell it and come and follow me, because your security is in that. And I'm telling you, what if it all evaporates, all the fish dry up, or all the elk, they become extinct? Then what? Well, gosh, I don't know. That's really a horrible thing. I know that not all of you hunters talk like that. I'm sorry. Forgive me, Carl. But he's saying to you, Lord have mercy, what time is it? 10:15. He's saying you're getting all your security out of that? The story you're telling yourself is wrong. You need to find your identity in me. Now, what are you going to do? What would your answer be? And really think about it, because I think it's important to ask the question, what would I do? And if your answer is Jesus, following him, or this, whatever it may be, and then you say, I can't, and you walk away? I mean, we really have to ask, why? What is it about that thing that makes it so attractive that we would choose it over Jesus? And we really just have to ask ourselves the question. If Jesus told me that, Rude, I know that you love the tricks and it's fun. It's a nice little hobby. I love you, babe, but you got to give that thing up. What would I do? Would I say, I can't? I know me enough to know that I would gladly, I would. If the Lord really asked me to, I'd say, all right. In fact, I'm doing that now because I could go and I really could go make a living doing magic, and I just don't because I'm called to this. So in a sense, I am. But what if there was another thing? Trust me, that's not the only thing that I cling to for security. There's lots of other stuff. Not lots, there are other things. Would I willingly give those up to fully give myself over to the Lord and find my identity and my security only in him? That is what this is about. And it's important. It's life and death. Again, I could, with this beautiful woman and the life that we have and our kids and our grandkids and all the blessings, my silly behavior, this story that I was telling myself, could have ruined all that. I'd just still be in the hood in San Jose, acting a fool, operating out of that self-destructive mindset. To what end? I'll never know, thank God. But some of the stories we're telling ourselves, some of the stories you're telling yourselves, and the behaviors associated are jacking you right now. They're hurting and harming you. In some cases, you don't see it because it seems like I'm just doing it's a harmless thing. And yet that thing is getting in the way of you really, really following Jesus. And so I believe that it's important that we examine these stories that we're telling ourselves and determine whether or not they are based on facts or lies, whether or not they're mere innocent hobbies, jobs, or actually idols of the heart. Jesus, through his Holy Spirit and through his word, are always challenging us to examine our life in light of the scriptures and truth. Examining our lives in light of the truth of God's word will help us rewrite those unhealthy and self-destructive stories so that we can live the abundant life that Jesus promised and that he died to give to us. All right, that's all I have to say about that.